Hello, and welcome to the first episode of our PowerTalk series. It's just a casual conversation with some of my favorite Marmon Utility colleagues. I'm Lindsay Lucarelli, and I'll be guiding today's conversation. PowerTalk is a space for Marmon Utility colleagues and industry experts to share our ideas, exchange a little bit of knowledge, and spark new ways of thinking about the challenges we face in the power industry. Today's topic is all about grid resilience, a critical issue that impacts every utility, regardless of size or location. We'll explore lessons learned from major disruptions, discuss how to evaluate grid integrity, and share practical steps utilities can take to reduce the risk of power interruptions. So let me introduce today's contributors. Fred Friton, applications engineer at Marmon Utility. Fred, he has decades of experience with Nashville Electric and has seeded an array of project and site experience from the lens of utility service providers. Jason Smolko, product manager at Marmon Utility, and he's not too far from his 10th candle on the Marmon Utility anniversary cake. He has a unique viewpoint of the market landscape, having been a Marmon Utility Regional Sales Manager organization earlier in 2023 as one of our valued product managers. Brian Trager, I think Brian's nickname should be the captain if it's not officially. His Marmon Utility tenure has spanned over 3 decades with leadership in the overhead solutions and international markets. And Karl Douglas, he started his industry career in the trucks and is an incredible team leader and solution designer with 37 years of field experience with one of our primary utility providers in the Northeast. I like to say that Karl is multilingual. He speaks lineman, engineer, design, training, and more. We are so lucky to have each and every one of you join our Marmon Utility in our first Power Talk discussion. So thank you for being here. So let's begin. There are disasters all over the place, and they're not specific to one region, one municipality, one issue. And if you just look at some of the more noteworthy ones that have happened since 2003. So Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in 2017, 80% of transmission and distribution lines were destroyed, leaving millions without power for months. It exposed vulnerabilities in grid resilience and disaster recovery planning. The winter storm Uri in 2021 really caused disruptions in Texas. Uri brought freezing temperatures to Texas, causing unprecedented power demand while freezing natural gas supplies. This resulted in widespread blackouts and underscored the need for weatherization and grid diversification. And we can't have a conversation without looking at some of the blackout occurrences like New York's 2000 blackout. In 2003, a cascading failure in the transmission grid caused a massive blackout in New York City and parts of the Northeast, leaving over 50 million people without power. It demonstrated how interconnected systems can fail when vulnerabilities align. And when we're all in the business of just making sure that the people in our communities have power, we can just empathize with the disruption when that power goes away. So you just saw a portfolio of various scenarios that capture New York, Texas, Puerto Rico. What do these incidents teach us about the vulnerabilities utilities face?
When we design a power line, we're designing it based on a set of codes that we believe will save the power lines from the bulk of any of the circumstances that they will see during their lifespan. But that's not necessarily true in every case. I can give one example of a line that I designed. It exceeded the code in every aspect, and it endured a load that exceeded 360,000 pounds. While I designed for all of this wind, ice, and all these other loadings, I didn't design for the roof to come off of a Shoney's and fly across an interstate into the power line. And so there are circumstances where we can say there is a high probability of damage and exposure to this line, and how do we mitigate in areas where we have that exposure? The power systems so often tell us where the problems are. We drive down the road and we see half a dozen splices in a span of wire. That's a easily mitigatable circumstance. That's a perfect application for ACS. Something small is getting into this wire. It's not taking down the poles, but it's enough to break the wire and cause utilities to go out there and re-sleeve it. So there are a lot of places where we can look at our own systems and say, there's a better way to build this power line so that crews are not going out every year and having to resplice it. Those are expenses that utilities have to absorb on their bottom line. A capital expenditure could save over decades.
And so I'm hearing you talk about risk mitigation. When I hear you say that you can't make a system immune to disruption when there's so many extraordinary circumstances that can happen, such as a roof blowing off. But then you talk about something like the splicing. So how do you balance, when do they make that decision to replace an entire cable versus Band-Aid it?
Let me step in with Fred. So with the utility I worked at, American Electric Power, if an underground cable fails, say twice, that is automatically replaced. When you have splices in overhead bare wire, I'm not sure how many times you go out there and put splices in before somebody in the planning department says, we probably ought to change that line out. These are difficult decisions. They should be made in the planning department. What Fred was getting at before, if we've got a whole bunch of splices in a line, in a close location, it's probably because there is something that we overlooked. There's animals coming out of the trees, getting zapped, burning the line down, that we have conductor clashing. We don't have sufficient separation between the phases to separate them during high wind events. I would leave that up to inspections for bare wire. For underground wire, it's an automatic decision. After you have so many faults, boom, you got to change it out because something's wrong with that cable.
The bottom line is when you have an outage in the first place, get people back on power right away. And the line crews get the power back up, and they're doing it the fastest and best way to do it at that moment. But as Brian alluded to, that could be a problem area there that just hasn't been dealt with. It's not up to the linemen at that point to say, hey, we should just reconductor this line real quick. They're going to quickly and carefully get that line spliced together, get those people back on power. But it does have the bigger picture of what's causing those repeated things and how does the planning department knows that, or could also be a partner utility working on it for mutual aid. And again, their job is to get power up there right away. I think there's multiple areas to look at that and try to plan improvement for the future.
To your point, if we're at a point of failure, the goal is to get people back up and running with power, period, in whatever sort of fix-it sensation that needs to take place. But then a proactive approach, how can utilities evaluate their grids to identify potential weaknesses and improve resilience? Karl?
Thank you. This is a really interesting conversation, and I'm enjoying it very much. I'm enjoying it more as a listener than a contributor. Lindsay, it's all about funding. It's all about putting Humpty Dumpty back together again when you have a storm. As Jason, Ryan, and Fred all alluded to, when a storm rolls through, there's nothing from a design standpoint that you're going to be able to put in place to protect a line from a tree traveling at 130 miles an hour. It's going to do damage. So, as Jason alluded to, you bring in mutual aid crews. They're focused on getting the power back on. So, they'll tie lines up in trees. They'll, use all sorts of real innovative approaches just to get the power back on. And then they leave. The system is handed back to the host utility. Now the host utility has to decide whether they have a funding source to put their not only to put their system back to its original configuration, but also what are those trouble spots and how can they build a more robust system to protect against the next storm. The most difficult thing about this is how do you predict a storm? You talked about Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico has just been hit time after time after time with hurricanes that roll right over the island from east to west. I worked down there in 1998 for 17 days on a relief mission, and it's hard to really imagine the devastation. We were there doing our thing. We got the lights back on for people, but we didn't do it all by Fred's design standards. We did what we had to do to get the power on. Did Puerto Rico put their system back together again? There's no funding source. You have to have a funding source to be able to rebuild the system and make it more robust in those most vulnerable areas.
Yeah, I will just say that we're talking about Hurricane Maria. I was involved with that a little bit, but PREPA, Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, prior to 2017, was not a storm-hardened system. It was a slapdash built kind of utility. After the hurricane, the U.S. government sent in funds. Business was sent to distributors because PREPA doesn't buy equipment. They buy equipment from local distributors who have local storage. They sent in outside linemen that came in from different states and Caribbean nations to help them put the stuff back together because they had mutual aid. A good portion of that rebuild was built incorrectly. So that was all installed improperly and just begging for premature failure. Trees were used as poles. Underground cable was mounted on poles. The restoration efforts were terribly inefficient, resulting in millions of dollars. Wasted and reliability problems that endure to this day. And unbelievable, you can't even imagine. God bless these linemen that come in and put everything back together, but a lot of times it's not up to code. You're just begging for problems afterwards.
Yeah. And that's not only true for Puerto Rico, that's true for almost every single natural disaster, whether it's, the fires out west or hurricanes. God bless the folks in North Carolina that had to endure the hurricane last fall. That's what happens. You got to get the lights back on.
Well, when we began this and you showed those videos and kind of like you even said, hey, these are some unique cases just to look at to jump off this conversation. I'm not really sure how unique they are. Look at the frequency of these things and the intensity. Even the Texas winter storm, Texas grid went down 10 years prior. So this is not the first time, and it's not 60 years ago it happened last. It was only 10 years ago. I live in central North Carolina. I had many friends affected in the Asheville area that didn't have water for weeks, didn't have electricity for weeks. I don't know how many times in even the past couple of years I've heard something about a 500-year storm. Well, how many 100-year storms or floods can occur in a 2 or 3 year span? That is alarming to me. Every single state in the U.S. has seen snow this year. The Florida Panhandle right now, I heard, had 8 inches, a record in that area. So looking at resiliency and building to code, maybe there's a need to increase some of the robustness of the codes, especially in certain areas. Because again, when you look at the intensity and frequency of some of these things going on, if we're going to continue to build to the code as a minimum, I think we're leaving vulnerabilities out in our electric grid.
Brian, earlier you were just speaking to specific tools or metrics that provide actionable insights. And you referenced one of your former organizations where you really did have those specific metrics. Is for those that are coming from groups that don't have metrics, what are ones that they can adopt?
Large utilities have what we call reliability departments. They use the SCADA or the control center data to record faults and calculate reliability indices, SAIDI, SAIFI, MAIDI, CAIDI. Which power lines suffer the worst or most frequent or longest outages? Okay, SAIDI is how many minutes each client is out per year, and SAIFI is how many outages each client has per year. They then take this data and run through standard procedures, which essentially entails a 7-step procedure. 1, assess existing conditions. What's the current state of your system? How old is the stuff? Where is it? What are your processes? Identify the vulnerabilities. Number 2, identify weaknesses within the infrastructure, processes, and systems that are susceptible to various threats, natural disasters, equipment failures, or even cyber attacks. 3, prioritize those vulnerabilities. Which threats loom largest and which areas need immediate attention and mitigation efforts. 4, perform risk assessment based on the identified vulnerabilities. Try to understand the potential impacts of those threats. For example, an overgrown right-of-way on a branch feeder serving 2 customers is going to have less of an economic impact than a tree growing into a 500 kV transmission line. So we've got to perform risk assessments after we get our vulnerabilities. 5, start doing the implementation of the mitigation measures, reduce vulnerabilities, upgrade equipment, underground, convert bare wire to cover wire, enhance cybersecurity, improve maintenance. 6, continuously monitor and continuously test your system. And lastly, collaboration and training. So we're going to have mutual aid agreements with our neighbors or with the whole United States, and we are going to continuously train not simply our linemen, but our engineering and our operations folks. So those are large utilities. How do we deal with this with small utilities? So if you look at the state of Massachusetts, it's not a big state, but there are 32 municipal electric departments.
Right.
The way these folks do it is they all collaborate. There's a MWRA, Mass. It's an association of mass municipal utilities. They buy in bulk. They train in bulk with the mass municipal blankets where they purchase cable and insulators and light bulbs and everything. They require those suppliers to have 25% of their annual purchase on hand 365 days a year. So when something bad happens, boom, that stuff just gets delivered and dumped in their utility. They're ready to go, and the mutual aid utilities are driving over there.
How important is collaboration with neighboring utilities or industry partners in reducing grid risk?
Yeah, absolutely. There's different size kids on the playground. Investor-owned utilities play by an entirely different set of rules than a small municipal or a co-op. As Brian said, a lot of the co-ops do collaborate. Virtually every geographic area, all of the utilities work together. They, when a storm hits Maine, that storm is probably also affecting Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut as well. And the same is true for the Midwest and Ohio and Iowa. And if they get hit, they all get hit. And they do collaborate and they do share. They have to share resources and move those resources from one company to another for the greater good.
So we have successful practices of the collaboration, of proactive evaluation, and Brian, you listed out a variety of different, very specific actions that people can take to protect their grid's vulnerabilities and to assess. But to flip this, we talk about codes and regulations and frameworks. Are there any regulatory frameworks that hinder resiliency efforts?
Sure. Funding. Yeah. Without a doubt, with investor-owned utilities bound by their regulator, and their regulator is going to lead them to funding sources that they can recuperate from their rate base, whereas a smaller co-op or a municipal, they have very limited ways to fund large-scale deployment or making a more robust system. They have one source. It's their members. It's the people that pay their bills. But with an investor-owned utility, a regulated utility, they have a few more options. So they can. Those are usually population-rich areas. So there's a bigger well to.
There are governmental or jurisdictional arrangements that yes can hinder risk management. In the Maui wildfire of 2023, firefighters were delayed in putting the fire out because they had to wait for permission from an indigenous group to take water from the reservoir. This took 6 hours. By the time they got permission to take water from the reservoir, the whole was burned down. Today, the current Los Angeles wildfires, Southern California had to resort to PSPS, which is public service power shutoffs due to the high Santa Ana winds. It's in their wildfire mitigation rules. If the winds are above 78 miles an hour and there are embers in the air, you open the switches. So the power lines are disconnected so that they cannot blow into the trees or the ground and ignite a wildfire. Fine, makes sense. However, the power shutoff precluded pumps from running, so even the firefighters watching the fires burn. It's just a tough situation, balancing the needs to wildfires or outages caused by power lines with the need to keep essential services on for the firefighters.
Let's bring this discussion to action. If you had to share one key recommendation with the utility looking to reduce the risk of disruption, what would it be? Jason?
Looking at your risk of disruption, most utilities will know their worst few circuits that are going out all the time. Target your the bottom 5 circuits and replace them every year. You looked at what your bottom 5 were, address that. I still believe that's an easy way, especially if you're a smaller utility, that could be a large percentage of your outages. But I mean, even if you could do 1 or 2, that could make a difference each year. If you were able to fix those, it would have a noteworthy reduction in your outages. I would recommend that.
I agree with Jason. Building upon what he said, vigilance amongst your employees, spotting potential problems, cracked poles, lines that have lots of splices in them. You've got staff that are out in the field every day looking at your system. They need to report on areas where there are potential problems and maintaining the system, keeping up with all of your maintenance, switch going through with your trimming and making sure that all of the things are in place that should be helping you reduce risks are being taken care of. Areas where the aging infrastructure appears to be a critical concern, pole maintenance and inspection processes, and see where the poles are in the worst condition. All of those things will improve the reliability of the system, then making the decisions.
Great insights. So, Karl, do you have anything to add?
I couldn't agree more with both Jason and Fred, without a doubt. To pick one, I'm not even sure that I could. You need a robust tree trimming program. You need to maintain your rights of way. A robust program for your main trunks, your big 3-phase lines that carry a lot of load and carry a lot of customer base. Those are the ones that you really want to focus on. I know you told me to pick one, Lindsay, but this to me is probably the most important thing is you got to practice. You got to practice your catastrophe. Okay. You can't go into these storms are going to happen. And I don't care if you have the most robust system in the entire world. Again, an oak tree traveling 130 miles an hour hitting a span of wire is going to take it down, period. So carry your teams. Get them into a real life situation where they have to act, react, stand, and deliver. But the truth of the matter is you gotta practice this stuff, and you gotta be ready for it when it happens.
Sure, Brian.
Yeah, echoing what Karl said, there's not one thing because it's a 7-step procedure: assess, identify, prioritize, risk assessment, mitigation measures, continuous monitoring, and collaboration and training. But I will say, if you wanted one thing, tree trimming. We're told the results of a Detroit Edison reliability study, how they did last year versus how they did this year. And the number one mitigation issue that reduced SAIDI and SAFE was tree trimming. The number 2 measure on their worst feeders was the fact that they had replaced bare wire with covered wire. But so tree trimming and conversion to covered conductor, those are the 2 mathematically favorable things that fixed SAIDI, improved SAIDI and SAFE.
I'd like to focus a little bit on spacer cable. So there's open wire and there's underground, and right in between and probably closer to underground, if you're going to build a robust system, spacer cable is the key. Back in my other days when I was a director of operations, when we had a circuit that is vulnerable or that has shown multiple outages, my background is replace the circuit with spacer cable and your problems go away, and they go away exponentially. And I have a great story. Littleton Electric, one of those municipalities in Massachusetts, their system is 95 to 96% spacer cable. Their SAFE, the frequency of outages is so incredibly low. Why? Is because they have as robust a system, affordable system for their ratepayers as you can possibly get. And spacer cable is the answer.
Fred, you had pinpointed the aging infrastructure, which is throughout the entire United States. It's not regionally specific, and that enhances the vulnerabilities that our power providers are up against. So prioritizing upgrades for aging infrastructure.
Aging infrastructure of underground cables that are now 50 or 60 years old. There needs to be a scheduled program for replacements for those items. When there was a code present when the lines were installed, is much lower than what we are designing to today. At some point in time, somebody's got to go through and say, this is our oldest components. These are the items that are our highest risk. Looking at substation transformers, there's so many throughout the United States that are long past the end of their life. The methodology of run to failure is not going to be an acceptable answer in a country where electricity has become a transportation fuel for people, and running things to failure is just not going to be an acceptable policy. You're going to have to get ahead and have things scheduled so that we can and maintain the reliability of the infrastructure. Identify the age of their assets, put those on a list, and structure their replacements so that they're hitting their worst known places. They're going to be more effective at avoiding major catastrophes with fallen poles and the time that it takes to replace those. And like Karl has said, it all hinges upon having funding and the demands on a utility to be able to serve new customers. There are a lot of demands on a utility and they all have to balance out. But at some point in time, somebody's got to go through and say, this is the worst, this is our oldest components. These are the items that are our highest risk. Looking at substation transformers, there's so many throughout the United States that are long past the end of their life, and they need to be looked at in terms of how much longer are we going to run these things, because the methodology of run to failure is not going to be an acceptable answer in a country where transportation is now provided and electricity has become a transportation fuel for people, and running things to failure is just not going to be an acceptable policy. You're going to have to get ahead and have things scheduled so that we can and maintain the reliability of the infrastructure.
Okay, so transportation is now intersecting with electric consumption just based on the popularity of electric vehicles. So how much is that impacting the management of, or the creation of, or the improvement of grid resiliency?
It's gonna impact it significantly. We're talking about all these new things we're trying to do. It's not just renewable energy we're trying to integrate in. We're trying to integrate in AI supercomputers that have taken 150 megawatts in Chicago, different places, Tennessee. We're trying to integrate new supercomputers for blockchain and cryptocurrency. We need major grid upgrades. We also have the integration of, again, EV charging stations. So we're talking about, well, maybe folks are charging their cars at home. That's nice. It's going to increase the load. Hopefully it's going to increase the load overnight. It's not going to be that problematic. The January issue of IEEE's Powered Energy magazine has articles on challenges of integrating EV charging stations for non-commercial vehicles as well as heavy trucks. So the EV charging stations for the heavy trucks is envisioned to be located in industrial park settings, and the loads drawn will be astronomical. We're not talking 10, 15 megawatts that a town of Milford, New Hampshire uses. We're talking 2, 3, 4, 5, 600 megawatts. You've got long haul 18-wheelers, trucks that are charging up. We've got mandates in California. 40% of the trucks got to be EVs by 6 years from now. We don't know the load profile. We don't know when people are going to be charging, how much they're going to be charging, what kind of probabilistic stochastic process it's going to be at each one of these sessions. And there are more questions and answers, and this will require further study, number one. But the EV demands on the electrical grid are just going to require not only transmission and distribution upgrades, but generation upgrades. Number two, they're going to wear out our electrical systems more. Number three, they're going to require greater reliability, because every time we add renewables, solar, blockchain, supercomputers, all this stuff, the stakes get higher. For a given outage, a power line goes out, instead of, a couple of houses going dark, we might incapacitate an AI data center that's being used for heavens knows, hospitals, doctors, whatever. We might incapacitate a long-haul EV charging center. That's going to strand 1,000, 2,000 long-haul trucks in Albuquerque, making this stuff up. But you get the idea. With all the changes we're making and all the new challenges, we have even a greater focus on reliability, and there are greater ramifications for individual faults. So we should harden the systems everywhere, transmission, distribution, and generation.
It's interesting for both business sectors as well as the residential sector, the demand becoming so much greater, but yet there's not a lot of awareness that more demand of product is straining the infrastructure. It sounds obvious, but I think general households basically equate power to be similar to running water. It's assumed that it will be there. So how important is it for the industry to educate people on the individual level?
It's definitely needed. I saw someone post on LinkedIn was I think a hedge fund guy. He showed a picture of a burning power pole from the LA fires and just said, wow, it's so amazing. Why don't they just put this underground? Like that was solving the whole thing. And the reason this person, captured that and put it, their point was this was someone who was not in the electrical industry. He doesn't understand the cost ramifications of putting that underground. To your point, yes, people turn on the light and open the faucet and expect it to work. Karl's already mentioned funding is an issue. Putting things underground is 5 to 10 times more expensive than overhead wires in some cases. I think most people, they're really happy with their electric bill right now. And if you say, we're going to tenfold it next year, it's this guy's like, hey, you just underground it and everything's solved, and there's much greater ramifications. But to your point, I think public education is important. I don't think people understand what goes into this because there's so many people trying to improve this. We talked about regulatory framework. There are some programs that the government is doing right now with the Department of Energy. They have a GRIP program to aid funding for resiliency, and that's good. And there's a lot of permitting issues specifically for transmission lines. They're trying to lessen some of those regulations to make it easier because there's long cases for that. So there is some progress on the regulatory side as well, but there's still more that we can do. Getting the public involved or more educated. There's a lot going on, and it's hard maybe for the public to understand what efforts are really going in to solve this because it's really all hands on deck right now. We just can't do it fast enough. Money and people.
And it's so multifaceted too, Jason. Along the lines of our electric system. It's the greatest man-made machine ever invented in the world. But you have your distribution, so you need your distribution. That's what feeds houses and plants and things of that nature. You need that to be robust. You need that to be reliable. The next thing is your distribution system isn't going to work very well if your transmission system isn't robust, because the transmission carries from your generator to your distribution loads. And Brian was talking about capacity. Your standard nuclear power plant is somewhere in the area of, let's say, 1,200 megawatts. Well, these supercomputers are going to be eating up half of that. The largest solar field are 1,000 megawatts. If we have all of these Google supercomputers and all of this AI out there that has to have reliable power, capacity is a real concern. You can keep the lights on all day, but if you don't have the capacity behind it driving the electrons to the sources, it's not a good story. All three to be working in concert together.
Talking about education, whether or not we need to educate citizens about reliability and what we need to do with the power system. I was at a wildfire conference as a speaker in Seattle, and we went to lunch, and I sat next to Public Utility Commission regulator for the state of Oregon, and we got talking about reliability. What do you do? I said, I work for this company. We build overhead lines. It's nice. She goes, oh, great. So let me ask you a question. You're a guy that knows. Why don't we just put everything underground? I said, yeah, let's do it. The ratepayers will love you. The only problem is you may jack your electric utility monthly bill 5 to 10x. So instead of saying, oh, well, that's, that, she said, well, isn't that the cost of doing business? I'm just an engineer. I'm not a regulator. I mean, if we want to put everything underground, great. I don't know that we can afford it, but these are good ideas.
And if
But
you
that
think,
also doesn't omit the need for maintenance, right? You still
No,
do have vulnerabilities for underground. It's not like bury it once and never need to think about it
yeah,
again.
yeah, great till you get a flood, right?
Right. There's still a vulnerability. There always will be.
Of course.
And that's what we experienced in
done fault
2010.
line underground systems. We've all dug up driveways. We've all dug up streets. Underground cable still has faults. It still has splice issues. It still has elbow failures. It still has pre-damage. It still has dig-ins. You jab a shovel into the ground, hit that cable. You got 1,000 people out of power for a week, easy. So yeah, we love underground cable, but nothing is perfect. And for crying out loud, the cost is unbelievable.
Let me make one other point about an underground system is that the cable's underground, but the devices that it connects to sit above ground. And in the case of a fire like you had out in California, all of the underground cable is going to be damaged because the heat from the fire is going to destroy the transformers, the pad mounted switches, all of those devices that are sitting above ground. They're all going to have to be replaced, and that is a monumental expense and a monumental effort in time of having to do that. And your conduit systems may be damaged and have to be replaced also. When we had the 2010 flood, the overhead system was fine. The underground system was destroyed. Now, the thing about a flood, and don't take this as an advantage, but when the flood came through and all those underground transformers were damaged, there was time to restore it because there was nobody left to serve. Because all of the customers' homes were flooded and were, as a result of that, unable to accept electricity, and the codes departments were going through and marking them as having to be condemned. So you had more time with the flood to restore your underground system, but those above grade devices are vulnerable to damages. And I know from my design experience that we put in all these underground and overhead services. At no point in time was there thought of one rechargeable car, electric EV vehicle at a home, much less 2, 3, maybe more. So we think about it in terms of somebody having an EV, maybe 2, 3, or more cars at a home that need to be charged. And if you've got passive electric power supplying power overnight, a solar array is not going to be available overnight. Wind may not be available. And so, we've got to have battery backups for those sources to be able to provide power. There are monumental challenges in terms of getting things prepared for what we see coming down the road.
I was impressed that Fred brought up that point. I didn't really think about it. So if I have a wildfire or a massive fault and I have to replace 2 poles and some bare wire or covered wire, I know how to do that pretty quickly. If I've got to pull out a mile of underground cable and I've got all the elbows and terminations, and that's a lot of dough and that's a lot of work, and that repair is probably 10x in the overhead line.
To say nothing of the environmental impact, right, Brian and Fred and Jason?
Yeah.
The environmental pad mount transformer is going to hold more oil. They're going to leak into drainage ditches and water supplies and things of that nature. It's not a good situation. Underground is okay in many circumstances. I don't think there's a silver bullet for hardening your system. I think there's a multitude of items that you can use to harden your system, but it's not a one size fits all.
No.
And you really have to assess your unique geographic location and demands
100%.
and infrastructures and funding. That wraps up today's Power Talk on grid resilience. Thank you to Fred, Jason, Brian, and Karl for their valuable insights. Here are a few key takeaways from today's conversation. 1, major disruptions remind us that no utility is immune to risk, but preparation is key. 2, evaluating grid structure requires a combination of assessment tools, collaboration, and forward-thinking innovation. And 3, immediate actions. like predictive maintenance and prioritizing aging infrastructure can make a significant difference while planning for long-term resilience. We hope this discussion and future Power Talks provides new ideas and practical solutions for your utility. At Marvin Utility, we don't just make parts, we partner with you to design and implement a solution that meets your unique community needs. Our goal is to help you reduce power delivery disruptions for your communities. Connect with us on LinkedIn, learn more at marvinutility.com, or let us know how we can help you with your unique project challenges at marvinutility.com/contact us. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time.